For this hour, we just want to take a look at the hashtag Fees Must Call story as we continue to cover it right here on SABC News. But now, Empowerdex, a BE company in South Africa, is calling for a funding model to make it possible for the country to pay for free education. It says free quality education is possible, but not now. Executive Chairman Vuyo Jack says the country needs to set targets and timeframes to meet the challenge of the hashtag Fees Must Fall campaign. He joins us in the studio to talk more about this. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks, Colin.
Well, surely talking about free education, if it's free, it means that somebody is paying for it.
Yes, so you can have a solution that can have zero fee education because there must be skin in the game. So when you look at free education, it's like there's no skin in the game. But when you look at zero fee education, then you can be able to have something that is contributed by everyone. And in essence, what we're saying is that you can be able to have a nation building fund that can then be able to deal with the problem, but not only at the university level, but deal with it comprehensively, because we need to be able to look at long-term solutions that are going to help build a nation.
Before we deal with it comprehensively, let's try to dissect the fractions. The issue of a tertiary education is that, number one, the fees are very high. Let's start there.
Absolutely. And the reason it's high is because you do have now infrastructure that you need to maintain. You need to be able to extend given the numbers that are coming in, because you have to open up access. That means that it puts pressure on the different infrastructure and the kind of ratio of your academics that you need to have. And to be able to attract people to come and work and be able to produce the credible research, you need to be paying them higher salaries.
But the issue of accessibility and affordability, other people are saying they are poor and they cannot afford education to be admitted at VETs, for example.
Yeah, and it's true. And it's a valid concern that, as you see, trying to be able to maintain infrastructure and get the academic excellence and so forth, it is increasing costs, and increasingly the students are finding it becomes unaffordable for them to do that.
How do you justify the argument that varsities normally increase fees by 16% and it's exorbitantly very, very high, and other people are saying, why can't we just talk about a fees increase in regards to CPIX plus 1?
Well, you know, I wouldn't want to really get into the nitty-gritties of that, because ultimately each university would have a different cost base and also would have the different numbers that come in. But in essence, the nub of the problem is that fees are not, in terms of the costs that are incurred by the varsity, the fees are not able to cover, because you have a third that is covered by the subsidy from government, a third that is covered by private income in terms of the foundations and so forth that contributes, and the third comes from fees. And it becomes, with economic growth, the way it is being forecasted, it becomes increasingly difficult, and people losing jobs, it becomes increasingly difficult. So we need to come up with a creative solution, given what we have, given the reality on the ground.
Right. I like the idea of your creative solutions. What exactly are you proposing in terms of quantifying the figure that you're talking about? Because NSFAS and government, you were saying that alone, they cannot afford to fund free education.
It's true, because when you look at government, on the tax side, they kind of take 5 million people, and it's decreasing, that are paying taxes, and you have 15 million people that are on some grant-based kind of funding from government. And that number is increasing the more you have the people losing jobs. So when you look at the fiscal numbers, purely without any emotion, you find that it's impossible. You can try to cut down costs and so forth and put fiscal discipline, but even with the fiscal savings that you're going to have, you're never going to be able to cover the full deficit that is needed. And therefore, and the universities themselves, they don't really have much options given the kind of setup that they have. So what is the solution? We need to be able to then look at the private sector and say, where can the private sector help? And then be able to have a vehicle that enables them to do that. And currently there isn't. So you have different initiatives and so forth, but there isn't that cohesive kind of instrument that can enable this to happen, but also happen in such a way that it drives economic growth. Because you just don't want to be paying bursaries or paying for fees and you're not seeing a return on that. You want to be able to see the return and actually see the economic growth increasing.
So now talking about how the universities can be able to train and do research in terms of contributing to the fiscus and, the mainstream economy. Let's talk about the issue of unemployed graduates, because when you were talking about it yesterday, it actually sounded like it's really a problem for South Africa to be producing educated personnel at entry level, but they don't have jobs, no companies to enter into so that they can participate in the mainstream economy.
Yes, that is a big problem. That's why you're seeing a lot of unemployed graduates, or if they get employed, they don't get employed in salaries that can enable them to be sustainable. And therefore, you can't even collect tax because some of the salaries are below the tax threshold. And so we then need to be able to look at the problem comprehensively and saying, how can we actually fill up those gaps? Because the reason you have that, you find that the foundational conceptual knowledge was lacking and it took them so long. And by the time they get out of the system, you find that it becomes very difficult for them to be actually employed. So when we think of a creative solution, is to be able to give them exposure much earlier to the realities of what an entrepreneur would be, for example. So part of our solution is, when you look at the Nation Building Fund, we would require all students to actually understand entrepreneurial mindset and a growth mindset. Even if I'm a social worker, I might be dealing with somebody who has talent, and actually I need to understand how I can be able to work with them in order for them to be successful entrepreneurs. So there is much more work that is needed before you can even have the people exiting from the system that can then, by the time they exit the system, they're able to be productive, either be able to start a company or be able to go into a job where they can hit the ground running.
Okay. We've been experiencing a shortfall in terms of funding varsity education or tertiary education. Now, this money, how much do you think can be able to be generated from it, looking at, well-capitalized companies at the JSC?
So there's different sources. When you look at the listed entities, you can be able to look at broad-based schemes where you're taking the existing target of 3%, which is not fulfilled completely, and say, how can we contribute in meeting this 3% target? And then you look at multinationals. They have what we call equity equivalents, whereby they don't allow, let's say internationally, the parents internationally don't allow them to sell, but they can then work out 25% of their South African operations can be put into a fund. Those are low-hanging fruits that have not actually been tapped into. So, and those are the kind of things that can be more of a long-term kind of solution. But there's also short-term kind of solutions on skills development. On an annual basis, companies...
I've run out of time, but now the last issue is comparative analysis of free education granted in, for example, right here, our neighbors, Botswana, are managing it. What do you think the right steps are followed to actually get to that? Very quickly.
Of course, because when you have diamonds and you're able to have excess capital coming from that and excess profit coming from that, you're able to then, from your cost base, be able to handle that. Now, when you look at South Africa and you look at our revenue kind of way we raise revenue, we do not have these kind of, for example, the royalty tax on mining companies was something that was contemplated to be able to say, can we have a ring fence kind of tax that can be able to do that? But that hasn't really worked in South Africa because the ring fenced kind of system from a tax-based perspective hasn't worked through the system. So there are, one would have to look at each individual country and say, what are the realities, and then be able to deal with the models that deal with those realities on the ground.
All right. Thank you very much. That's Vuyo Jack, who is the Executive Chairman of Africa Empowerdex. Well, thank you very much for your insight.
Thank you.
All right. Let's bring it to the end. I'll be back after 5